We're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. This week we have a guest author by the name of Eva Elasigue. I'm hoping I'm saying that right.
Elasigue? Yeah.
Elasigue, even better. See, this is why I'm a linguist, because I just love hearing it said correctly. Elasigue, awesome. I'm there. And so tell us a little bit about the books that you're going to be talking with us about today.
My series, Bones of Starlight, is set in an alternate universe that has a lot of futuristic and asynchronous elements. So, as far as world building goes, it's gone about as deep as it could, down to what can I allow physically that will fit the story. Does the story element work scientifically? All of those things from an alternate universe perspective. And it's a fantasy space opera on a really large scale. So that includes social systems, science, justice, everything everything I question a little bit and look at with a world building perspective,
Cool.
as well as where the characters come from in their history.
This sounds really interesting. So let's start at the underpinning level. I want to ask you about physical laws in your universe. What was the process that you went through when you were thinking about how to sort of establish that underpinning?
Some of it is driven by the story element or dynamic. A crisis event is occurring, and I think about how it unfolds, and I have to apply some elements of science in order for it to feel real. How fast does lava move? How fast does lava move on that world? Is it feasible? Can a reader accept it in their comprehension, even if it's a little different? So there are some living beings that interface with the universe a little differently. So how do they interface with the universe differently? I try and think of an unknown animal intelligence. How does it view the universe if I'm writing from its perspective and see its place in it from its existence?
Sure. So when you talk about living beings that interface with the universe differently, are these human characters or they're non-human characters?
Both, because human technologies have evolved with non-human technologies in the Pan-Galactic Imperium. It's about 24 generations into space exploration and colonization of planets inhabited and not.
Okay.
It generally hasn't been a matter of Roman conquest, supposedly. So.
Okay.
I'm not sure I got around to the crux of your question. Humans. Sorry, I can.
No. Just tell them. I'd like to hear more about the humans and whatever alien species you're working with.
Sure. The Aquarii use different parts of the spectrum, as well as ours. So things like we know of as subsonic that elephants use, or supersonic, or non-visual like infrared or ultraviolet. And what if there were spectra outside of that were involved in the Aquaria's entire expressive mode? Then I kind of question it. And how far does the reader want to comprehend it? How much does it just...
I've got, this to finish.
Right.
That's one example. There are also physically involved dragons, and I look at that from an almost internally scientific perspective too.
Okay, go into detail.
Just the tiny bit of detail could be that Dragons have a basic elemental relationship with the universe and its physical structure. So
Mm-hmm.
their existence is almost entirely unique, and their perpetuation is really mysterious. Like, when does a new element pop into the universe, and what is an element in the universe? Uh,
Uh-huh.
is is rumor an element in the universe? Is a whisper on the wind an element? Is a cold current an element, whether it's in the air or underwater? Um, how do these elements become a being that's alive? It's sort of magical, but I'm just writing it from that perspective. That's the place in the universe that they occupy, is sort of physical and scientific elements embodied in really powerful beings that then have to learn how to relate to each other in those ways.
Yeah.
So you're not talking about chemical elements by elements, but you're talking about it could be a concept, a thought, an action.
Yeah, it seems like maybe, I mean,
Not like carbon and
are
oxygen.
they a little bit more on the level of earth, water, wind, and fire kind of elements?
Yes and no. Um, Maybe not strictly physical, but if you wanted to describe phosphorus to someone who didn't understand what phosphorus was, you could say, "Oh, it's this funny smelling yellow clay that we dig out of the earth, and we can set it on fire, and it has incendiary properties." Or if someone were researching phosphorus, and you can imagine this scientist getting really into it and examining its properties. What if phosphorus, being alive, described itself from a more poetic perspective of something that were alive? What would phosphorus say? Phosphorus says, "I come from below." Phosphorus says, "I can explode." Um, Phosphorus says, "I can make things grow." Would that be a dragon? Maybe.
Okay, so it looks like you're sort of navigating an interesting border between fantasy and what we would traditionally call fantasy and what we would call science fiction, to sort of say, I'm going to maybe smudge that borderline or use terminology from both sides and have it kind of overlap.
Yeah, sort of in a lines blurred kind of perspective, uh, where science can be seen from a poetic point of view. I've been inspired in the past, for example, by uh, Leibniz, who is one
Mm.
of the co-founders of, or co-developers of calculus, and the ways he described calculus were sort of spiritual. And that's how he came up with an equation or three.
That's interesting. So a minute ago, you were talking about how the Imperium wasn't like ancient Rome, and then you gave a kind of a laugh. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that. Um, tell me about the Imperium and how you put it together.
Um, Firstly, I started from the perspective of the main characters, which is to various degrees innocent. Um, sort of the way that an average citizen who was happy, or maybe even less than happy, might view the Imperium, which is where everybody lives.
Okay.
And the information or people that are coming out and social dynamics that were hidden um, impact the characters as they're revealed. So that's how I reveal it to the reader too.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I often like to talk about is how characters will act as sort of ambassadors to the world that they inhabit. Do you also include outsiders to the Imperium, or is it mostly insiders?
That's where some things turn about. There are events that sort of turn things. Some tables are flipped
Mm-hmm.
and turned, and upheavals, and just small revelations happening on a personal level for people
Okay.
who are important to the conflict. And that's where it begins. Just this sort of moment of, gosh, I didn't know that before, and now I don't know how I feel about it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's some of the things that the characters undergo. So, people outside the Imperium, people inside the Imperium don't think there really are any.
Okay.
So that seems possibly naive, considering that two other species are two other sentient peoples are part of the Imperium.
Mm-hmm.
Really, there are no others, which is kind of how we feel here on Earth. Our perspective is, well, where are the others? Aren't there any? Or maybe there aren't any others that we know
Mm-hmm.
of, right? So um, this is we start with that sort of insular security, and these are maybe sort of cascading moments of contact. Like they've already made contact with other species, and they're about to make contact with others, but have they already? Like this is something we talk about in our conspiracy theories as well. Have we already? What are the moments where we did already? Lots of different people have stories of contact, and those are all floating around. So what is it like when someone realizes that a chain of contacts is now going to turn the empire inside out?
Yeah. So, okay. I'm trying to think about which path I want to take forward from here. You definitely have at least two characters that are on different social levels within the structure of the Imperium, right? And I'm sure that you have more than that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you explored social differences in that context?
Sure. What's expected of different generations in the same social strata? For instance, the first book looks a lot at the imperial family, probably more than the next two will. Oh, I can't really say that. But, different members of the imperial. This is a really intergenerational section. Right there's a grandmother who is queen. It's sort of looking at family and intergenerationality through the structure of monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's the queen ascendant, her daughter, who is kind of in this middle position that isn't always filled. There's the princess, the scion, who is younger, and then there are her younger siblings going all the way down, and there's her father too, who's part of the whole structure. Siblings of both genders, and what's expected of them. There's also another young character
Mm-hmm.
who's definitely not royal. In fact, he's the opposite. He's practically a vagabond, and he's getting by. And what does the universe look like from? Hi, is that a German Shepherd?
Yeah, dinner time.
So what the universe looks like from an autonomous child versus a highly directed, like an autonomous young person versus a highly directed, highly structured life of a prince to be.
Right.
And then there are a lot of different professionals. There are professionals in science, in corporation, in trucking, and independent security, and private eye, things like that. They're all playing their parts. Yeah.
Cool. Does anybody have pets? This is a trick question.
Um, that is a trick question.
I'm just messing with you because we're marking on Deborah's dog. um,
There are some pets that walk down the boulevard, but so far the main characters haven't shown any.
yeah. Um, you know, there are always these funny little questions that you never actually uh, think about because you're busy writing the main thread of the story, and then you go back and you're like, wait a second, does anybody have pets? Or you know, something that happened to me was like I was like, wait a second, does anybody wear glasses? you know, um, these funny little questions that come up.
Yeah.
You
Oh,
were gonna say
there
something?
is a researcher who wears glasses. Yes. And the
That's awesome.
illustration I drew of that scene had her just holding them as she staggered out of an escape pod to her timely rescue.
Okay, so you've so this is clearly a you've got ships, right? Do you have you worked out the basis of the system of transportation and to what extent?
Um, to some extent, yeah. Not every. I haven't designed local networks, for
Yeah.
instance, but certain parts of how does it all link together um, are actually major plot elements. Like there's a major private company that developed the intergalactic transportation modules, which are basically these gates that traffic goes to, collects at, and is sent through
hmm
um, by a combination of the latest technological breakthroughs and also members of the Imperium that support the network. Like, say, our IT systems wouldn't proceed very well without their technicians.
hmm
Same way, the intergalactic gate travel network wouldn't proceed very well without the Aquarii Send Singers, who have a couple similar um, counterparts in other literature, like the Spice Lords of Dune, or um, the, well, to use the pejorative term that they hated, the stevedores from the Rowan series, and those telekinetics who would send items and people through intergalactic space from Capella to Aldebaran. Um, they were human telekinetics who would shunt things through space. So those are two other sort of transporters that are a little bit like the Aquarius End Singers, who enable the intergalactic gateways with the help of certain other elements and technologies.
Cool. So I'm taking it. I understand that the Aquarii are one of the two sentient species that are also involved in the Imperium.
Right. The two others, there's people who are more or less humans, so
hmm
humans like us, who their history started on one planet and then expanded to include now 49 planets. And I didn't set that target number, but I think it's funny that I grew up in the United States and came up with an intergalactic imperium consisting of 49 planets. Uh,
Coincidences.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Who are the other ones?
and the dragons.
Oh,
Yes.
the dragons. Okay. So
Dragons
you
count
had
as
mentioned the
people.
dragons, but I wasn't sure that they were, um, they're the other species. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So,
They're unique, and there are not very many of them, but they're a significant presence. We couldn't have done it without them.
Right.
The Imperium wouldn't have existed quite in the same way without them.
Okay, so are we trying to avoid spoilers here?
I
In
am
our
avoiding
discussion?
spoilers a little. The second book is on its way out, and
What's the second book called?
The Unfolding Abyss.
Okay, so the first one is Fire on All Sides. Am I right?
Yeah, in the Bones of Starlight, and sometimes I throw a "the" in there. It doesn't really belong, but in Bones of Starlight, it's Fire on All Sides, The Unfolding Abyss, and I've projected the title for the third already. So,
Tell us.
uh, Impending Heights Beyond.
All right. That will be I'll note that down as the working title.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's got its ISBN already.
Oh, okay. Um, so how would you describe the overall arc of what you're working on here? What kind of a story is it in the grand scheme of things? I mean, I understand that it's space opera, but like, what are the kinds of core conflicts? Is it the fall of the Imperium? Is that what we're dealing with, or is it something slightly different?
The main driving element, almost, I could draw a parallel from. I started by going along the lines of a hero's journey for the
Hmm.
characters, and then bringing it into the broader picture, how that would ripple outwards on a all sort of not all-encompassing scale, because I like to think that there are parts of the intergalactic universe that are completely unaffected by all of these events. but uh, so, but if you were to ask the question of what is the main driving line underneath Star Wars, like maybe it's about the Empire, or maybe it's about Luke, or maybe it's also about Han and Leia and the robots.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of
So it's
different like levels of complexity on which you can grapple with this question.
yeah,
I mention it because when I was back in the very, very early stages of working on my mega universe, I was like, "Hey, honey," I turned to my husband and I was like, "Hey, honey, I need to bring down the government. Can you help me?" so, so I
that's
mean,
a
that was
stick
just
in front of
definitely
the
one of
fire moment, right?
the. Anyway, so super. Okay, so what would you call your favorite aspects of this universe?
Probably the different peoples, um, and how they relate and how they fit in on a cosmic scale. Uh, Sort of writing with non-human perspectives that humans can understand enough to even interact with. Yeah, that
So,
might be one of my favorite parts. Aside from these interesting characters that uh, just the threads have been sticking to them in a nice cohesive way that makes me feel like they themselves are cohesive.
sorry, I'm grappling with two telephones that are ringing next to me. I'm like, stop. So I want to ask you about writing from different perspectives. Um, did Was that something that you did from the very beginning of your writing process on this book?
Yeah, yeah. I identified certain people who are going to be part of the story, and I knew that I didn't want to write it from just one character. Maybe that's not my style, but I sort of some of my favorite series, my favorite formative series would change perspective a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one main example being, say, Tad Williams.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Kind of a round robin of touching into different storylines. Um, that I like personally. I was aiming for a braid.
Okay.
I like the feeling of weaving, mainly because I like seeing things from different perspectives. So
Mm-hmm.
that's how the storyline is evolving.
That's pretty cool. Um, I agree that writing in different perspectives can be really, really fun. Especially when they don't agree on things. Um, I noticed some interesting technologies. So I thought maybe we could talk about that for a couple minutes. Um, like for example, I was intrigued by uh, sort of psychically sensitive wall paint.
Yeah, yeah. Not just paint, but actually, think of it as a neighborhood-wide mural installation created by highly sensitive artists that could build that in as a continuing dynamic. What exactly they used, is it paint? The aquarii have, all these spectra that we were talking about.
Yeah.
They just sort of call it singing sometimes because right, all these frequencies and colors happening and singing. To what extent that actually influences the media they're working with? Like they're great at theatrical effects. Can they make those
Hmm.
theatrical effects stick to a wall? And you can sort of emote at them and they'll get you because of all those spectra they have access to, which seems kind of psychic to us because we can't see these things. But
Hmm.
it's just like, how would they interlay spectral reactivity onto into an architectural neighborhood in a way that doesn't jam technology or whatever. Just imagining that it's possible and that there's this neighborhood that has this interactive art that everybody said they were okay with and doesn't mind, and that makes the place truly unique and part of the capital.
Well, so I find that very interesting. You gotta wonder, who gave permission for the install. Were they deliberately going, ooh, if I put this special installation in my neighborhood, then maybe people can't keep secrets from me as easily. Or I mean, I see a lot of different kinds of potential there.
Maybe, or maybe it's a matter of what you let leak out. Like once we must be familiar enough with them to not be totally uncomfortable in their presence, like we're naked or something. So perhaps if it's with the understanding that it's more reflective. Like if you're in a room of mirrors, are you always worried if somebody's seeing an expression that you didn't mean to show, for example?
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe only about as, you know, self-revealing as that. I mean, and yeah, that's a good question. Like, what would people allow on that scale? Like how uncomfortable are we, or how advanced would we have to be? Do we have to be like Michael from Stranger in a Strange Land, who has totally different social constructs and therefore has different senses of what's weird or not?
Yeah. Um, so, are there? So, tell us a little bit more about the capital city.
It's supposedly the same city from the most ancient times. I mean, if we can think of our cultural roots back to, say, Sumer, where
Mm.
language began, um, then maybe one city rose and fell with all the empires on that planet, but then again became capital once people began to leave the planet for other territories
Mm-hmm.
and still retained all of its most ancient history, then that would be Alessander capital, which was also called Babylon Magus in the old myth. There's an old myth where it's called Babylon Magus, and they replay that one as a
Mm-hmm.
matter of remembering those old traditions, and Babylon Magus was destroyed since then, and they talk about why, just sort of as a caution to the rulers and people of today to think about
Mm-hmm.
the future, things like that. So
How
it's
big is it?
area-wise, it has about 20 neighborhoods, but I don't always like, I sort of like to use analog measurements rather than metrics personally, because maybe that's a bit of a fantasy element to me, is that
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to bring out the ruler. I just like to give people a sense of how big it is. Does it feel big? How many places are in it? Does it feel old? Again, like I haven't brought out a timeline ruler either. The Imperium has 24 generations since people left the planet, so that's sort of measurable.
Mm-hmm.
Although that makes you wonder how long some of the generations were, and so far I haven't concerned myself too deeply with exactly that. I sort of took on, I think in the Japanese Empire, they had a convention of naming an era after the person who ruled it. And that was the
Yeah,
time.
they still do, in fact.
The time of so and so. Yeah, and so that's kind of how it works in this history, and that's how I refer back. So,
Cool. Um, did you? So I mean, I take it that you got some of your inspiration then from Japanese models, or was there one particular social model that you used more than any others, or was it a sort of let's use Sumer and Japan and all of the above?
oh yeah. Yeah, a little bit, a dash of this and a dash of that. Reading foundation myths as a way of kind of understanding cultural bases. That's something I continue to do. Say, right now I've opened one on fairy lore. Um, so this comes from sort of Eastern European and other perspectives too. But so
Mm-hmm.
that's one. And I was just given a copy of the Kalevala, which is a Finnish tale of full of folk tales and heroes and cultural foundations. I read Gilgamesh, and so it's just all these little things. I can't even, begin to trot out the library of all the different myths, but I try and it's definitely not single origin as the main
Right.
focus, because trying to think of all humans involved in one empire kind of is the like a realistic sense of uh, I don't even know what to call it, a pan
Well, I mean, there's
galactic
there's a
imperium.
great deal of complexity in our world, so you know, one of the things that I sometimes struggle with on in my thinking is the idea of consistency versus diversity, right? And because I like to think about language underpinnings for a lot of things. And a lot of times, if you have names of places and people and stuff to sort of match sound wise, it's kind of cool because things feel really consistent. But on the other hand, our life is full of all kinds of different names for places and people and things because of all the cultural mixing that's occurred in our history. Um, so it makes sense in some ways to be consistent and in other ways to be inconsistent. if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like to be. I try to aim for things sounding polyglot,
Mm-hmm.
like from a place we don't know. Uh, how do these two names go together? I've never seen them together. That means it must be from this alternate future universe that fits in my world.
Right.
So,
Have you done a lot of work with language?
I have a little bit of foundation and a few. I can je parle français, uh, and I understand konti konti lang of Tagalog, a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of ASL. Uh, and back when I studied a little bit of English in my long and varied college career, I got into some of Chomsky's linguistics. And of course, I've gotten my Latin from a scientific background in biology. There was a lot of Latin. I really
Mm-hmm.
enjoyed Greek roots. I visited Greece and learned how to read their alphabet. So all that experience and a youth in California meant that I couldn't help but learn some Spanish.
Yeah.
Poquito.
Right. So, so would you say that all of this influences how you imagine a polyglot society in this?
I'm sorry, how I imagine a polyglot society.
Dragons have their own language.
Um, the Aquaria and dragons could certainly communicate amongst themselves without our input. Like without our understanding either, because they're differently sentient. Would we be able to spy on them any more than they can spy on us? Probably less. Um, but are there some of us who understand them to a greater extent? Us. I keep on thinking of humans in my storybooks as us, and I try not to say us because they're different. They're uncanny. They inhabit sort of an uncanny valley of humanity, like really like us, but not exactly. Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah, there are ways that dragons communicate uh, that are outside of our understanding, and ways I communicate that are out of our understanding, and ways that we interact socially that are not their ways either. So
Mm-hmm.
there's this cross-cultural element, and that so I apply human perspectives as from a human when it comes to human origins. I think, well, there are 49 planets. Whatever countries they came from on the original planet, it's been 24 generations since then. That is long enough for really, really, really distinct cultures that we couldn't predict to arise.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I seek them out sort of by the flavor. Some flavors might seem familiar and reminiscent of some of our cultures, but I hope that none of them looks exactly reminiscent of our known cultures.
Okay, so let me ask Morgan and Deborah if you have any questions.
Well, I went away for a while.
You did indeed.
After the dog.
Dog.
We're glad that you're back.
Yeah, right. So, so I missed a big chunk. I So is this like one long story, or is this a series of standalone books that are set in this world that you have spent so much time developing?
It's a projected 3-book series. Yeah. So
Oh, okay. Is that one? Is that a trilogy, or is that a 3-book series where they're standalones?
It's a trilogy. Yeah, they're all intrinsically linked and belong together. So they would go together into an omnibus. Yeah.
Okay. And is this your first big project?
Yep. Yeah. Actually, well, I mean, if it feels like NaNoWriMo was my first big project, but yeah,
Yeah.
this is the first one that's gone to bound print. Um, but this is the project after all projects. This is the project that uh, may not have been. So it's kind of the only thing I'm really focusing on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Uh, I do have plans for afterward that are not strict specifically this project, so I don't actually want to stay writing in that one vein. I don't plan to write in it perpetually. It has an ending, and then I wish to depart in certain ways,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
story-wise. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Brian, I
the reason I asked is it has to do with writing process that I've heard you talk a lot about um, how characters and plot sort of drove world building rather than you spent 25 years creating this world and
And now
there was all
something
the
had to happen
backstory,
to it.
sort of the Tolkien method. And different people do it in different ways. And I have a pet theory that when people do the Tolkien method, they end up with lots and lots of stories which are not necessarily connected. That a reader could pick up any one of them and not necessarily have to know anything about the rest. Because the world itself is so big. Um, as opposed to when you start with a storyline or a specific set of characters, and then the world sort of encloses them and is fleshed out as you go on adventures with them, in which case you get very tightly related stories or one huge story arc like Lord of the Rings. So I was curious as to where world building and storytelling intersected for you.
Tolkien was one of my great inspirations. Some can take it or leave it, but it was a book that called to me from across the hallway. And when I could get my hands on it, yeah, read it over and over. And I went into the backstory. I actually read all the Silmarillion and the unexpected tales, or unexpected, unfinished tales.
Finished. I had it up to you. I kept falling asleep.
So about I think I started The Hobbit in sixth grade, and then maybe I was world building at that point. I had already been reading Anne McCaffrey, so I think I might have started my first sort of world building exercises after the Dragon Riders of Pern series and the Rowan series.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this is a little different from those in the sense that on a couple previous go-arounds in world building, I had built the world first. That was what intrigued me most about it. I'd made countries and landscapes and people, and there was sort of a story, which was the reason why I was building the world, but I would definitely pursue it into the corners. And in this case, I think I had more impetus uh, with everything I'd done and tried before to push the story to its conclusion, which a story must have one, generally.
I know Brian wanted to ask you a question. Brian, are you ready to do that?
I am. I been sitting here maintaining the same face for about an hour, so now I'm going to try to talk without moving my lips. Actually, it's the first question. I actually have two questions. The first one has to do with research. You've created the space opera in an alternate universe, and it sounds like you've put a lot of thought and effort into giving it a lot of realism. I'm just curious what sort of tools or methodology you've done, or like areas of focus you've really focused on for doing research to bring your world building alive.
I think a lot of my research goes into plausibility. Because I mean, a lot of the things that one might normally research, such as like vacuum physics and craft exit and reentry, things like that take a lot of research in hard science fiction. Um, I fit it into the story, and does it sound like that's something that the Imperium is capable of at this time? Like, given their level of evolution. So that's sort of, it's really, really macro, and I can't refer to single documents. So this is why I take in a lot of both old myths and nonfiction topics, social topics. Yeah, just taking in a lot of large-scale perspectives. I try not to focus too much on specific histories, because then I might reflect a specific history that isn't this story. I'm not trying to talk about, you know, how we feel. I'm not trying to talk about World War II. Even though someone might say, like, oh, this part looks like World War II, well, that's because it's written from a human perspective, and those things happen.
Right.
But yeah, yeah. So,
well,
just
you know,
trying.
as readers, we tend to accumulate a lot of information over the course of our lives that we can't necessarily say, well, I got this from this book and that from that book. So, you know, especially when you're working in a secondary universe, a lot of it is coming from that sort of big body of stuff that you sort of gradually accumulated over years. What was your second question, Brian?
Oh, the second question has to do with, it's kind of a loaded question, so let me see if I can make it more succinct. I've recently been reading a blog post by Hugh Howey that was talking about the idea of presenting fantastical ideas in your fiction and to make them believable. And the kind of the thrust of the idea is, you know, you've got this fantastical thing, but you know, that would be, you know, wondrous to us, but for the people living in the world, it wouldn't be, you know, that's something they might, you know, just take as commonplace. And one of the ways that you can present it is to, you know, present an idea, but then break it. Like have, you know, something, you know, some fantastical technology, but then something goes wrong with that, and then you can kind of expose it, you know, the guts of it. I was just wondering if you've done anything with that in this story, if it's something that you consciously do in order to make it more accessible. I'm just, you know, what your thoughts are on that subject.
Sure. I can think of one main example, that being of the travel gates, that this sort of the way we take air flight for granted. Not totally for granted, but if we've had this sort of crisis recently with a lot of the airlines going bankrupt. That's money is a substance they have a hard time doing without. And I just realized I've maybe crossed a line into spoiler territory. That's about as far as I should go.
That's okay. No, I mean, most people who watch the show are like, yeah, we know spoilers are going to happen.
Yeah, but hey, there's a teaser, right? Like, it's sort of like this.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's
and
it.
all the gates could stop working. But no, we wouldn't want to tell you whether that actually happens.
Well, we didn't lose our airlines, for instance. It just became a little more expensive. But it might have seemed like we were going to lose our airlines to some people who were trying to save them.
Right. Interesting. Well, we're running to the end of our hour. Any other thoughts that anybody would like to share? All right. Then I will say thank you very much for being here, Eva. It was so great to talk to you and great to meet you, and I'm really glad that we could have you on the show.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you
everybody,
so
for
much.
attending at an unusual time.
Thanks for hosting me. This has been really exciting. It's been a fun conversation.
I'm really glad you could be here. I'm going to stop the broadcast.